Thank you so much, Professor, for your time. And
It's a great pleasure to be here and to meet you both.
thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor. So, to start with, Professor, um, have you visited India before?
Indeed, this is my fifth trip to India, and the first time I came as a young backpacker from Australia in 1975.
Wow. Right.
And so over these 5 trips, I visited actually most parts of your wonderful country.
Right. Thank you. So, what changes do you see? Do you see any change over the years, if any?
Yes, I mean, it's immense changes over this 40-year period. Quite honestly, when I first came to India, I arrived in Calcutta
Right.
in 1975. And there was poverty in the streets, and the quality of infrastructure was not very good, and it was not so clean, actually. And
Right.
now, India is a very modern, advanced country,
Right.
and it's quite striking the changes that have taken place.
Interesting.
So, Professor, we'll be going through your book, Asian Century. I must say, it's a wonderful book.
Thank
So,
you.
I just have a question from your book. Which kind of democracy you believe India is?
I think that India is a very successful democracy, and as we were discussing before, many countries, when they achieved independence after colonization, became democracies, but then lost their democracies as authoritarian regimes took over and military regimes took over. But India has managed to maintain and strengthen its democracy, and has done very well in doing that. So I think it's very impressive, India's democracy, for several reasons. One, you're such an enormous country with a federal system. Managing such a democracy is not easy. And of course, going from a poor country to a middle-income country, again, it's not very easy holding a democracy together. So I'm very impressed with India's democracy, and you're an example, I think, to many other Asian countries.
Absolutely. So, you wrote about the role of democracy in economy. Could you throw some light on this?
Many people question how useful democracy is in economic development, and many people who are fans of China say that authoritarianism is good because you can make decisions more quickly and implement decisions. But in a democracy like India or Australia, my country, when you make a decision and you have everyone involved in the decision-making process, the decision is longer to take, but I think more solid and more reliable and more sustainable. The second point I'd like to make about democracy is that as countries climb the development ladder, they have to go from being a copycat country to being an innovation and creation country. And, you need an open society and a democratic society to be a really creative, open society. I think that this is a very strong point for India going forward. I think this is a very strong point for India in your very successful IT industry today.
So, Professor, a recent phenomenon we see across the world, or even in the Asia-Pacific region, is the concept of trade wars, be it related to US-China, or very recently the issues that have cropped up between Japan and South Korea. We would like to know what are your views on this, and whether India can benefit from these trade wars. Or it would be great if you could shed some light on this.
Sure. I mean, the trade wars is a very, very complex subject, and many people are saying that Mr. Trump is very protectionist. I think it's more complicated than that. It is true, Mr. Trump says that he is in favour of free, fair and reciprocal trade. I think the key word is reciprocal. And when we're looking at America's trade with China, it is not reciprocal. The American market is open and China's market is not open.
Right.
And on top of that, China implements many practices which are not friendly towards trade, like intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, cyber intrusions and so on.
Right.
So I think that Trump is correct in identifying a China problem. And I think that many people, even in Europe and elsewhere in Asia, agree that there is a China problem in that sense. Is Mr. Trump going about the China problem the right way? Maybe not.
Right.
The problem with Mr. Trump, of course, is that he's a lone ranger. He does things alone.
Right.
And the best way to tackle the China problem, I think, is to bring all your friends together and take on China together as a team,
Right.
not sort of insult the other people. And secondly, I think the best way to tackle China is not doing it by tweets and public embarrassment. It's behind closed doors in a diplomatic way so that we don't embarrass our Chinese friends. But, you know, the trade war is on. It's a reality we have to deal with. And it's true that the trade war is having many different effects around the world, and we'll probably see many effects for a long time. But one effect is, of course, that foreign investors and even Chinese business people themselves are now moving productive activity out of China. This has been going on for some time already, as wage costs have been going up in China, but the trade war has accelerated this, and a couple of countries that have been benefiting from this, namely Vietnam has, Indonesia, Philippines, and so on. And this really is a good opportunity for India. From what I understand, some investors have moved out of China towards India, but maybe not as much as we would like to see. And I think that the Indian government has to be very responsive to this opportunity. And this means, of course, making India friendly to foreign investors, improving infrastructure, improving human capital. But I should congratulate Mr. Modi, because the recent cut in the income tax for corporations, this will make India more attractive for foreign investors to attract investment out of China and to develop India's participation in manufacturing global value chains.
So, Professor, on the same line, what do you believe the government of India can do as far as improving the skill sets of its citizens are concerned? Because that's going to be a huge measure to be taken to be in line to receive investments in the manufacturing sector. Could you tell us some more about it?
Improving the human capital in India is a big challenge. But a problem for many countries like India is that often they focus on university and higher education, whereas I think the real education challenge for India is actually developing skills, vocational training for tradesmen, people who can apply these skills in factories and not just be PhD economists. And so skill development is number one. The second point I'd like to emphasize is women. And you know, India's education has been improving quite a lot, including for women, but women's education is still way behind that of men in this country. And I think that women are a great asset to the society and to the economy, and the government should invest more in the skills of women. And Japan, of course, is a country where I teach and I know quite well. In Japan, women are better educated than men, and according to studies by the OECD and UNESCO, and that's the case in many countries actually. And so the women factor, I think, is very important for India's future.
So we are hearing about the economic slowdown. So is it the global phenomena, or it is just a bad phase in India or the Asia Pacific, and we must get over this by some sort of the skill development or investment into certain sectors? What's your views on it?
Thank you. It's a very important question. There are certainly some international factors that are behind the slowdown in the Indian economy, like the trade war and the decline in GDP growth. There are also some short-term factors in the Indian situation which are relevant, like the demonetization initiative and the changes to the GST, the Goods and Services Tax. But I think that the slowdown has highlighted a deep problem in the Indian system which needs to be changed. And that is that in India you have mainly state-owned big banks that provide finance to big Indian companies, and often these companies' financing doesn't go through a strict credit evaluation process. Some might call this crony capitalism, the close relationship between big banks and big companies. And of course, as a result of this, many of the big Indian companies have bad debts and the banks have bad debts. And so we need to clean up this debt situation in the corporate sector. The government's making some initiatives there. But we also need to move to more commercially based lending, where all loan proposals are evaluated on strict credit criteria. And I would say that we also need to privatize the banks. We need to have more of a market economy in the financial sector. And so I think this is a big issue in India going forward, to clean up the financial sector and move to strict commercial-based lending. but it's a challenge to do so because obviously politicians like to be involved in the activities of state-owned banks and like to help out friends in direct lending, but this really is dragging the economy down. And although India really is a great capitalist economy, a capitalist nation, in the area of bank finance it is not. It's still quite socialistic and therefore inefficient.
So, Professor, I mean, we share a unique and strategic relationship with Australia. And in this regard, how do you think we could build an economic partnership that is mutually beneficial to each other? And how exactly do you believe that migration from India is perceived in Australia? Because that's been one of the sticking points in our free trade agreement with Australia.
Yes, so thank you for raising the question about the friendship between our two countries. You know, Australia and India have been great friends for, in fact, hundreds of years. We've had Indian people coming to Australia for the last couple of hundred years. And we always used to say in Australia that our countries are bound together by 3 C's.
Right.
Curry, cricket and Commonwealth.
Right.
But of course, that's very interesting and important. But for a long time, our relationship didn't go any deeper. But now it is a much deeper relationship. We now have about 700,000 people of Indian origin living in Australia. You're very much part of the Australian nation. We have lots of Indian students studying in Australia. Again, it's a very positive thing. And in contrast to, say, students from China or other Asian countries, which are often there to learn English,
Right.
our Indian students come knowing English and often study technology, science, medicine and so on, and building on that, make a contribution to the Australian economy. So Indians are our Indian Australians and Indian friends are a great asset for Australia. But of course, we need to go further, we need to go beyond that. One issue that has cropped up in Australia is the need to diversify our economy, to be less dependent on China than we have been in the past. And the obvious friend to develop further relationships with is India. And so we need to build up a stronger trade investment relationship with India. I think it's in the interest of both of our countries, and having a free trade agreement which covers issues like services trade is a very important thing there. I know that the Indian government and the Australian government don't see exactly eye to eye on this,
Sure.
that the Indian government would like more access for Indian technology service providers to the Australian economy. But I think it's just a question of balance. And I think that, I would not interpret that negatively.
Right.
And, Australia's population is only 25 million,
Right.
and many migrants all come to Sydney and Melbourne. And so maybe it's just a question of the speed with which we accept migrants from India. But the Australian relationship with India is a very strong relationship, a very positive one, and I hope that in the future that it will become even stronger.
In fact, yesterday, on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly meet, our Honourable External Affairs Minister met the Foreign Minister of Australia, and there appears to have been some sort of agreement on maritime cooperation.
Okay.
So that's a good. It's one of our areas of cooperation, defence and maritime capabilities. We are working on it.
But I think that what you're saying, it's an excellent example of how we can work together. And of course, the rise of China has been a very positive thing in many ways for the world. But of course, China doesn't have the same values as democracies like our own. And China has become very assertive. And I think that one response to China is not to try and hold China back, but for like-minded democracies like Australia, India, Japan, New Zealand and so on, to work together to promote respect for the rules-based system, to promote respect for human rights and democracy.
Professor, you recently visited Dharamshala. It's a beautiful place, I must say. Also, it is known in India as the seat of government of exile, Tibet. And this is the place where His Holiness Dalai Lama resides. So what's your views on His Holiness and the Tibet issue, and especially the Chinese policy in regard with Tibet, and the policy which China is acquiring around its neighbors and especially the Asia Pacific region or its boundaries with India or the South China Sea? So what's your thoughts?
Thank you for such a challenging question. Dharamshala is a wonderful place. I think you haven't been there, so you must go. And for myself as a cricket fan, one of the first things I wanted to see was the cricket field there. Because from the middle of the cricket field, you see the Himalayas. It's so beautiful, perhaps the most beautiful cricket field in the world. But more generally, it's very beautiful up there, the mountain scenery, and there's lots of temples and monasteries in the mountains and so on. But as you quite rightly say, it's the home for the Tibetan government in exile and the home for the Dalai Lama. I think that India has done a wonderful job in receiving the refugees from Tibet and hosting the Dalai Lama and his government. And I congratulate the Indian country and government for welcoming Tibet. The situation for the poor Tibetan people in China is really not a good situation. It's a very worrying situation. I think that the position of the Dalai Lama himself, who is a very moderate man, is a very sound position. He's not asking for political independence from China. He's happy for Tibet to be part of the Chinese nation. But what he would like would be independence and autonomy from a cultural and social point of view. And this is where we see the Tibetan people are suffering, because the Chinese government is moving in Han Chinese people, and we'll see at some point in time where the Tibetans are a minority in their own area. And of course, the Chinese government is very repressive and towards human rights issues for the poor Tibetan people who are suffering greatly. And from my understanding, the Chinese government is sort of waiting for the Dalai Lama to die, and they think that the Tibetan problem or Tibetan issue will disappear after that occurs. That may not be true. What I'm concerned about is that the Dalai Lama and the government in exile in Dharamshala is quite moderate. But when the Dalai Lama leaves and the Tibetans in Tibet maybe have more power over the Tibetan political issues, the Tibetans may in fact become much more militant, and there may be social and political unrest in Tibet. And we would all suffer from that. That's a bad thing. And our Chinese friends often underestimate the extent to which people don't enjoy the repression that they apply to other people. And Hong Kong, I think, is the big lesson there. Hong Kong, one of the richest economies in the world. You would imagine that the Hong Kong people would be happy there. But in fact, the Hong Kong people are very unhappy about many aspects of life in Hong Kong, and particularly unhappy about the activities of the Chinese government. So I sympathize greatly with our Tibetan friends. I think that our Tibetan friends deserve to have a freedom of cultural expression, freedom of social activities, and be respected by the Chinese government. But that is not the case, and it's a tragic situation.
So, Professor, following up on that, my question to you is, do you have any piece of advice for the Indian government to deal with this issue? What more do you think they could do in this regard? I mean, thinking of the consequences ahead, or do you think India needs to rethink its policy as far as the issue of Tibet is concerned?
Do you mean to become more pro-Chinese?
I mean, either way. I mean, being more proactive for the Tibetan people, becoming a voice for the Tibetan people in international forums, etc.
I think the Indian government and all of us should do as much as we can to help the Tibetan people. I believe in cultural self-determination, that we should all be able to determine our own society and culture and live that. Unfortunately, the Chinese government doesn't agree with that approach. For them, they are the boss of Tibet, and the Tibetan people are not their own boss. And the more that the government of India and all our governments can do to raise the issue of the Tibetans in international discussions, international fora like the United Nations, that's a very good thing. And a big problem, of course, with the rise of China's power is that most Western countries are very keen to get into the Chinese market and sell everything, But as they do that, they're prepared to go soft on issues like Tibet and human rights. And that's a bad thing. I think that our moral values and ethics are very important. I think that, yes, India should be very active, and it's a very important issue to take China on.
So, Professor, you have been to a lot of Southeast Asian countries. You have been through their economies. In what ways you feel that China is impacting their sovereignty, the South China Sea especially?
It's a very important and challenging question. It seems clear to me that China would like to dominate Southeast Asia, and the first way in which it's seeking to dominate is through economic domination. China is now the leading trade investment partner for all of the Southeast Asian countries. Secondly, China is now involving most of the Southeast Asian countries in its Belt and Road Initiative, investing in infrastructure in these countries. And because of these close links, it is applying political pressure on Southeast Asian countries to do what China wants them to do. And we see this most clearly in the case of Cambodia and Laos. Now when ASEAN, Southeast Asia, gets together for political meetings, all the countries will express their point of view, but very often Cambodia expresses a Chinese point of view, and rather than a point of view that of the Southeast Asian countries themselves. More recently, the Philippines is a country which is actually becoming closer to China, and the Philippine president is very keen to sort of be friendly to China and get investment from the Chinese government. Other countries in Southeast Asia are resisting the Chinese pressure. Vietnam is one. They've had a long, tense relationship with China, but again, they're economically dependent. And so, yes, China is trying to dominate this part of the world and is having lots of success. And of course, this impinges on the sovereignty of these countries. And so the second point that you raise is that of the South China Seas. Now, historically, the South China Seas has been international waters, the high seas. And that means that it doesn't belong to any one country, and that means that all countries should be able to have freedom of navigation through those areas. Now, of recent years, what's happened is that the Chinese government has occupied rocks and atolls and other geological formations in that area and built up, artificial islands and artificial airstrips and so on. And so they basically privatized the area for themselves in a way which is against international law, as we saw in the decision of the Tribunal of the United Nations Law of the Sea. Having gone that far, Xi Jinping, when he met with President Obama at the White House a few years ago, promised to not militarize these installations. And of course, they've militarized these installations. And so what the Chinese have done in the South China Sea is very, very worrying from many points of view. Firstly, they've basically taken international territory for themselves. Secondly, they've put military installations there which represent a threat to anyone wanting to go in that area. But thirdly and fundamentally, they have defied the international law. They've defied the liberal-based global order. And since the end of the Second World War, we've had a liberal-based international order which has enabled the whole world to live together in basic peace, allowed the world to live together with trade and investment and so on. And once we have this breaking of international rule of law, breaking of the international order, we end up in a situation like now where it's almost the Wild West for international relations. And this is a very, very worrying sign. And, if we go this far, what do we end up with? And I know that some people say, well, it doesn't matter, the South China Sea is a long way from Washington and London. But if the Chinese do this in the South China Sea, could they do it in the Mediterranean? Could they do it in the Gulf of Mexico?
Absolutely.
And you start in one place, it could end up anywhere. And of course, I know that many of my Indian friends are also worried about not just the South China Sea, but worried about what the Chinese government is doing in the Indian Ocean. And so once you end up on this slippery slope of breaking the laws it's a very dangerous trend.
So, Professor, in this wonderful book of yours, titled Asian Century on a Knife Edge, you have actually argued that the Asian century might actually belong to India and not China. That's a very unique perspective. Could you explain more on this?
Thank you. It's in fact, this perspective has raised lots of questions from many
Yes.
people. But
Indeed.
you know, China has done very, very well for about 3 or 4 decades. But China now is in, I think, difficult territory. Firstly, China's working age population has already been declining for 6 years, and it will decline even further. So aging population is a big issue for China. Secondly, China doesn't believe in market economy. It was liberalising and opening up its economy for a while, and did well at that. But reform has basically been slow for the last 10 years, and now under President Xi Jinping, the reform is going backwards. They're very keen to have state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks having an important role in the economy. This is not good for economic efficiency and economic productivity. And thirdly, a very important factor for continuing with economic growth, as we discussed before, is innovation and creativity. In a repressive society where the Communist Party wants to control everything, I think it doesn't really help innovation and creativity. India, it's the opposite case in many ways. India's population at the end of this century will probably be around 1.5 billion, 1.5 billion according to the United Nations. China will only be 1 billion. And so you're 50% bigger. So you have a population advantage over China. Secondly, India's economic reform has been going slowly, and sometimes people are a bit frustrated at that, but it keeps going. It keeps going. And even now, I think that Mr. Modi's been highlighting the importance of governance, not government, and the quality of governance is improving quite a lot. So I'm confident that India will carry on with its important reform. And thirdly, of course, democracy and open society. And you know, India is a very creative, innovative economy. We see this already in the IT sector, in Bangalore and Hyderabad and so on. And so I see India as being very, has lots of potential when it comes to creativity and innovation. And thirdly, or fourthly rather, India has the world's biggest diaspora community. And lots of the Indian diaspora are very successful and very prosperous. I think this will create lots of linkages between Western economies and India and other economies. I see the diaspora as being a very good motor for India's development. So yes, I see India as being perhaps the world's leading economy into the second half of the 21st century.
Right. In fact, on this very point, our former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, had once remarked that it's indeed true that India does move very slowly like an elephant, but each step it takes leaves a meaningful impact for the world ahead.
Yeah. So I think he's right. It's I think that many people, forget or overlook India. And I notice this in Australia, that everyone's obsessed with China. And the Americans are obsessed with China. And they're wrong. India is very, very important.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your time. It's been a really enriching experience, and it's always great to know that we have a friend. India does have a friend, and who believes in us. Thank you so much, Professor, for your time.
No, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful time to discuss with you, and I've learned more from you than I could ever teach you. And thank you, my dear friend.
For your time and this valuable book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.